Hello, welcome to today's screencast. The focus now is moving on to the vascular system, and the topic we're going to be focusing on today is called the mechanisms that maintain venous return. Now, as a quick recap, before we go on to today's actual content topic, I suppose, which is the mechanisms to maintain venous return, I just want to do a quick recap. You do not need to make notes on this slide, but you could just listen. So if we have a look so far then, we should have an understanding of what venous return is. So if we have a look onto here, onto the heart diagram or our circulatory system diagram, if we have a look at here, we should be aware by now that when we exercise, when our muscles contract, following that, we have blood returned to the heart, and this is called venous return. Now, if you have a look at what we've done in previous lessons, before we move on to today's topic, let's have a quick look. Where have we heard this term venous return so far? Now, we haven't heard it, it's not in the specification, but in order to describe certain areas in the specification, we need to be able to talk about it. So the first thing that we had a look at that links to venous return is when we're looking at how we regulate heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output. So we had a look at how intrinsic control factors will allow us to regulate our heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output. If you remember, what we did is when we see intrinsic control, to help us memorize the two factors within intrinsic control, we respelt it to intrinsic control. And that then led us to the two factors within intrinsic control to regulate heart rate, which were venous return and temperature. And more specifically, we are aware that when we're looking at today's topic, if we're thinking about venous return, we talked about this idea that if you exercise and you were trying to regulate heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output, you would need an increased venous return in order to do that. So within intrinsic control, there's two parts, but because today's lesson is focused on venous return, we're just going to talk about that in this one here. Obviously, you could talk about temperature as well. Now, another area from the specification that we have mentioned this term venous return is linked to stroke volume and its response to exercise. So during exercise, we had a look at a graph for stroke volume. We had a look at the changes that took place at that graph. Although that's very important to revise, it's not directly linked to today's lesson. However, what is linked, if we know that stroke volume in the most basic form increases during exercise, we also had a look at to say, right, if we know that stroke volume increases during exercise, as it does at point 1 on this graph, the next thing we had to say is, right, stroke volume is the volume of blood ejected from the left ventricle per beat. So during exercise, that increases. Then what we had to ask ourselves, okay, so it increases, great, we can read a graph. Well, we have to understand what are the physiological reasons as to how it increases. So how does stroke volume increase? Well, if we want to get blood ejected from the heart faster during exercise, we have to get it back faster, okay, and that is called venous return. So stroke volume increases via venous return, and if you remember, we looked at the steps that when blood goes back to the right atrium, we had a look at what happens to the firing rate of the SA node, we had a look at the blood being forced down to the ventricle walls, and then following that, we had a look at that idea of the stretch, the contractility, and that leading to an increased stroke volume and cardiac output. So that was the previous lessons. Now, I think it's really, really important to just put that in because we've seen that venous return can help us increase a heart rate via intrinsic control. We've also seen that actually the reason stroke volume increases during exercise is because of venous return. So we've used this twice, okay? So we have a real understanding now of the steps by which venous return can increase our heart rate, our stroke volume, and our cardiac output. Today's lesson then is looking at, okay, we've looked at the effect venous return can have on stroke volume, heart rate, cardiac output. Now what we need to do is have a look at the mechanisms that allow venous return to take place in the first place, because it works on quite an interesting anomaly here. Because if you have a look, everything physiologically about venous return, I suppose it doesn't make sense, because if you have a look at here when you've exercised and the blood going back to the heart, if you look at the blue blood here, this is because it's deoxygenated. What this means is there's extremely low pressure. So what happens when this blood is going back? What it's saying is, because all the oxygen's out of it, because there's low pressure, there's a real possibility that this blood could end up falling back down this way and leading to blood clots. Now, in order to stop this, there are certain mechanisms that allow venous return to take place, and they are really, really important for our today's focus. So we start off then, let's have a look at these 5 mechanisms that help maintain venous return. You need to start making notes now. I'll keep the venous return diagram here. On top of that, I'm just going to put this, which will make more sense as we go through. Right, first thing then, when we are trying to get the blood back to the right atrium here, back to the heart via venous return, It's done via veins. You might know that from GCSE PE, because veins will take the blood back towards the heart. So let's have a look at how specifically the veins get that blood back to the heart following exercise. Okay, so from here, first way, something called the muscle pump. Now, muscle pump refers to skeletal muscles, the muscles we studied at the start of the muscular system, squeezing together to pump the blood back to the heart. So, for example, you might think of the rectus femoris, the bicep femoris, squeezing back together, okay? And they squeeze in here, as you can see, and push the blood back up this way, if we imagine that was here, back up there, okay? That's our first one. Next one is gravity. So basically what this is saying, that any blood that is above the heart, so for example in our upper body, is forced back down towards the heart. Okay, so the other way we can do it is any blood that is up here in terms of our body, I suppose, or if you think of your body now, anything above your waist, it is then squeezed back down via gravity, because what goes up must come down, and it is forced back down to our heart. Okay, that's our next one. Third one is smooth muscle. Now, smooth muscle is talking about the kind of, I suppose, the muscles in the veins, okay? So the kind of smooth muscle area in the veins, and they kind of contract, a bit like the skeletal muscles, but this time they're inside the veins to squeeze the blood back to the heart. And as you can see, every single time the blood goes back to the heart, blood goes back to the heart. So whatever the factor is, its end product is to send blood back to the heart. Final one, penultimate one, is something called pocket valves. Now, you'll all have an understanding of valves. If you have a look at this diagram over here, when you look at how valves help maintain venous return, they do it because when the blood is coming back up here, as you can see on this valve here, the valves snap shut. Okay, so when they snap shut, when the blood comes back up here, if it was coming back around there, as soon as it goes through, they snap shut. Now, because of that, they prevent that backflow of blood I was talking about. Because if they weren't there, the blood, because it's such low pressure, could end up coming back down this way. Final one then is the respiratory pump, and this basically talks about within our lungs, okay, you won't have studied this yet, within our lung area, okay, and rib cage, this is called the thoracic cavity, okay, or the thorax, and in the thoracic cavity, what happens during a kind of exercise is there's a change in pressure, okay, so it's a change in pressure, of air pressure, and when that change of pressure happens, it actually allows the blood to be pushed back to the heart. So you have to learn this section here, so the pressure change in the thoracic cavity, okay, within the lungs, okay. Because of the change, this causes the blood to then get squeezed back or pushed back towards the heart. Okay, so there are your key sections. Make good notes, please. Remember, this slide is the majority of the notes, but hopefully the first slide gave you a good bit of recap. Okay, thanks very much. Good questions on these. All right, thank you.